Nearly $7 trillion. That's how much money the federal government spent in 2024. What would you do if you were given the power to decide how to spend all that cash? Turn America's schools into cathedrals of learning? Strengthen the nation's military? Launch a race to defeat cancer? All plausible ideas that it turns out are basically impossible. Where do our tax dollars actually go? It's a question Americans often ask, usually when 3 lanes have been shut down but there are no construction workers anywhere. We are, after all, a fabulously wealthy nation, so whatever your priorities, better schools, a bigger military, improved healthcare, tougher border enforcement, you'd think that Congress would be able to find enough money in the till to get us top-of-the-line stuff. And here's the thing, not really. And the reason why is kind of weird. Because while the Constitution gives Congress control over how to spend our tax dollars, Congress actually doesn't have much control over how we spend our tax dollars. Here's what we mean. In the 2024 fiscal year, the federal government spent $6.8 trillion. The amount that Congress actually got to decide how to spend, about $1.8 trillion, or only a little over 25%. How does this happen? Well, there are 2 major categories of federal spending. That $1.8 trillion is called discretionary spending, money that Congress is free to spend every year on whatever they think is important. But another $4.1 trillion, more than double as much, went to what's called mandatory spending, money that Congress is essentially obligated to spend. Those are things like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And if you've checked our math and realized there's still almost $1 trillion unaccounted for, that is all interest payments on the national debt. Put all those pieces together and you get a federal budget that looks like this. In other words, the federal government is basically an insurance company that happens to have a military. Now, you could be forgiven for asking why any of this matters. After all, most Americans are pretty fond of their Social Security and Medicare benefits. And since we spend our entire working lives paying into those programs, how could it be a problem when we get our money back? Well, this is where things get tricky, because none of these programs work the way we think they do. And to put a finer point on it, none of them work the way politicians usually imply they do. If Social Security and Medicare were just compulsory savings programs, put your money in today so you'll have it to use when you retire, there wouldn't be much of a problem here. But here's the thing, they're not. What you get out of these programs is not just the money you paid in plus interest. The average retiring couple has paid $214,000 into Medicare and will take out $635,000 in benefits. And most Social Security recipients get more money out of the system than they pay in as well. Which is a great deal for today's retirees, but leads to some enormous problems. For one thing, it means these programs are running out of money. Fast. Over the next 30 years, they're estimated to run short by a combined $124 trillion. How do you get out of debt that large? Honestly, America's best bet is probably to fake its death, assume Switzerland's identity, and hope no one catches on. But short of that, the options are pretty unappealing. Enormous tax hikes that would cripple the economy, big cuts to benefits, or some combination of the two. And if instead you decide to just keep putting it all on the country's credit card, well, things get shaky really fast. At our current rate, we're only 10 years away from mandatory spending growing to take up nearly 80% of the federal budget, which means only about 20% would be left for everything from national defense to highways to national parks. We're already at the point where we're spending more every year on interest for the national debt than we are for national defense or Medicare. And as of 2025, half of our new debt is spent paying the interest on our old debt. In other words, the country desperately needs to place a call to Dave Ramsey.
You are seriously broke. I mean, seriously broke.
But here's the thing. This isn't just a story about America's coming debt crisis. It's a story about what happens when the government isn't willing to shoot straight with us. Because these problems aren't limited to things like Social Security and Medicare. The cost of retirement and healthcare benefits for military veterans has gotten so expensive, for example, that their share of the federal budget doubled between 2001 and 2020, while the actual number of veterans decreased by 6.8 million. And as a result, several former secretaries of defense have warned that the system is unsustainable, not only because it's so expensive, but because it means less money to pay new service members. As one former Marine Corps general put it, we continue to spend large amounts to pay for the force of yesterday at the expense of the force of tomorrow. And it's the same story at the state and local level. The issue there is how many states and cities have promised pension benefits to government employees that they can't possibly deliver on. Because, much like Social Security, they guarantee beneficiaries a certain dollar amount regardless of what they paid in or what market conditions are. The result? As of the end of 2024, 45 states don't have enough money to cover the pensions they've promised to workers. For an extreme example of this, we can look to the city of Chicago, whose pensions are $53 billion in the hole, the consequences of which are pretty predictable. Because of that shortfall, more than 80% of the city's property taxes end up going to pensions. That means less money for things like Chicago's schools, its police force, or its infrastructure, which may explain why everyone in the city is a little on edge. And when you put all these pieces together, you get a country that's spending an awful lot of money on the past and very little on the future. Analysis from the Urban Institute, for example, found that in 2021, 33% of federal spending went to benefits for adults and programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The proportion the country spent on children, about 9%. And to be clear, the people collecting all these benefits aren't the bad guys here. In many cases, they're the victims. These are often people who built their lives around retirement promises that may end up being denied them at a time in their life when there's not much they can do about it. Really caring for those people would have meant making reasonable promises we could keep, not extravagant ones that were destined to break. But instead, politicians spent decades telling us what we want to hear, knowing they wouldn't be around when the bill comes due, which has left us in a world where we're going to have to make tough decisions, because those politicians have left us with no better alternative. I mean, the Switzerland thing is just not realistic.